Today, we will be talking about Pakistan Afghanistan relations in the backdrop of the recent visit of Prime Minister Imran Khan to Afghanistan. Our guest today is senior journalist, author, and political commentator Mr. Imtiaz Gul, who is also the executive director of the Center for Research and Security Studies, which he established in 2007. Mr. Imtiaz Gul is the author of several books, including The Al Qaeda Connection, Pakistan Before and After Osama, and The Most Dangerous Place, Pakistan's Lawless Frontiers. Thank you, Imtiaz Gul Saab, for coming to us for this interview. As we are aware that Prime Minister Imran Khan visited Afghanistan on November 19, the visit was called historic by President Ashraf Ghani. How was the visit received in Afghanistan overall?
Generally, I think Prime Minister Imran Khan has a very charismatic personality. A lot of people connect with him, relate with him because of his cricketing career. And that's why we could see that wherever he went, whether it was President Ghani or his Vice President Amrullah Saleh, who is in a very love-hate relationship with Pakistan, he himself also appeared to be overwhelmed with the presence of the Pakistani Prime Minister. So as a whole, I think this was a huge confidence-building measure between the two countries and a big step from Pakistan's side for the Prime Minister to have gone into Kabul and then reassured the President as well as his team that Pakistan is concerned about the rising violence or the unusual levels of violence in Afghanistan. And I think that was a very strong message, I would say, delivered to the Taliban indirectly, that they have to reduce the level of violence if they want to find the way forward for reconciliation.
The visit comes soon after that dossier on Indian involvement in sabotage activities in Pakistan was released, and that also mentioned the role of the Indian diplomats or the Indian spies located in Afghanistan in sabotage activities in Pakistan. So Afghanistan was mentioned in that dossier, and this visit came soon after that. So do you think it might have been discussed and it might have been raised with the Afghan officials?
Regardless whether this dossier was discussed between the President of Afghanistan and the Prime Minister of Pakistan, there's a very stark reality that we all face, and that is Afghanistan having been used for proxy terrorism, whether it's against Pakistan or against China. And that is, I think, almost undeniable. And there's even no plausibility of denial, just because we saw that on November the 5th, the outgoing Secretary of State delisted the ETIM from the terror list. And that was quite a curious case, but it also underscored, I think, the reality of proxy wars, that an organization which the America itself co-sponsored to be designated as a terrorist organization was being delisted just when the election results were clear. It had become clear that Joe Biden is coming in, and these are policy decisions which the outgoing governments usually don't take. But Mike Pompeo made it sure that within 1 week of his 2+2 meeting in New Delhi on October the 29th, he announced the delisting of ETIM. And obviously it gives a cause, not only to the Chinese, but also to Pakistan, that there is some mischief up their sleeves, and that probably the Americans or the Indians would like to use ETIM or the TTP as instruments of instability, as proxies in this war that has been imposed on Pakistan, the war that had been imposed on China, particularly in the Xinjiang province. So as a whole, I think these things have become quite crystal clear, and this is a common challenge, not only to Pakistan, but also to China, how to neutralize proxy terrorist actors operating out of Afghanistan.
The vision document also talks about some specific timelines. One of that is to develop a joint proposal for the return of refugees by the end of the year. How optimistic are you with regard to that?
Well, I have a different take on the issue of refugees. The proposal or the solution that is coming from the Pakistani side is mostly bureaucratic. It's very narrow-ended. Over 60% of the Afghan refugees population living in Pakistan currently are those who have been born in Pakistan. So I would personally think that those Afghans basically should be naturalized as Pakistanis, provided a permanent residence, if not Pakistani citizenship. They can be your brand ambassadors. We should basically take that sword off their heads, sword of repatriation, forced eviction. So I personally think Pakistan should really take a liberal view of this situation, and why not turn all these people, which are basically more than 1 million young Afghans, into our ambassadors, goodwill ambassadors. And most of them are mainstreamed into Pakistani education system as well as into the economy anyway. So while this may be a very legitimate excuse, while this is a very legitimate concern that a number of terrorists come and hide behind the refugee settlements, this is quite possible. But this does not mean that we should force all the Afghans, even those born here in Pakistan, back to Afghanistan. Instead of improving our systems, our surveillance, our documentation, we should not be scapegoating those young Afghans who have been born here. This is my view on this.
And how far do you think is the Afghan government responsible in not creating a sustainable solution for Afghan refugees to return to their homeland?
I think we should not expect too much from the Afghan government. The country has been embattled. It's more than 4 decades that this has been going through turmoil. A government which cannot sustain itself without external support can really not think of providing some sustainable solution for resettlement of the refugees. There are simply too many problems that dog the forward movement, whether it's economic or political, in Afghanistan. And now placing this entire onus on the Afghan government, I think, is politically very unfair, and also logistically, the Afghan government is unable to do anything just because there are so many problems. It's an intricate cobweb of problems, political, economic, social, that prevent the Afghan government from really focusing on an issue such as refugees.
The vision document also talks about regional connectivity. And in your today's Matrix Mag article, you are also talking about Pakistan learning from the example of Turkey and China, which have established trading relations with Israel, notwithstanding their adverse political relations. So how do you think this regional connectivity proposal should be taken by both Afghanistan and Pakistan, and what should Pakistan be thinking about regional connectivity overall in the region?
I think regional connectivity is the way forward, is the key to economic progress within and without. There's no doubt about this. Pakistan is also very clear on the need, on the criticality of free economic corridors. What I understand from our conversations with top-tier leadership of Pakistan is that while our north-south corridor is developed from between Karachi and Peshawar, our east-west corridor is really hampered by our political adversarial relationship with India. And Pakistani leadership currently thinks that facilitating and opening, smoothing this east-west corridor is critical to Pakistan's development as well as Pakistan's access through Afghanistan to Central Asia. It's the entire onus is now on the neighbors to the west and to the east. On the east, the Indian government really has to review its policy of this adversarial relationship with Pakistan. They have to basically give up this brinkmanship. The neighbor on the west basically is itself embattled. It doesn't have, I think, much space to think about how to facilitate the establishment of this east-west corridor. However, there are very well-meaning people within Afghanistan, within the government, outside the government, who really would like to see their country connected with India via Pakistan and Pakistan connected with Central Asia via Afghanistan. So somehow this is the responsibility of all those well-meaning people to lobby for this cross-border connectivity. And I think therein lies the economic salvation and progress of all three countries.
The situation between India and Pakistan is very complex, which is determined by a lot of factors other than economic considerations. So, do you see that there are takers in India of improving economic connectivity with Pakistan, considering the acrimonious relationship and what has been going on between India and Pakistan with regard to Kashmir?
I think the Indian government at present is in no mood to open up to Pakistan, to step down from its stated acrimonious position vis-a-vis Pakistan. The ball is in the court of India, but India, the current government itself has basically antagonized Pakistan as well as China by creating a new situation in Kashmir after August 5th illegal, for the reinforcement of its illegal occupation of Kashmir. That has obviously created new hurdles in the way of normalization of a relationship. And the entire onus, I think, is on India how to de-escalate the situation through steps that it can take, it may take to soften the opposition to its actions in Kashmir, to take Kashmiris on board. And that way, I think it will also then take Pakistan on board, because Pakistan's position is anchored in the well-being of the Kashmiris, in the self-determination for the Kashmiris. So once that issue is taken care of, probably it also paves way for reconnecting both India and Pakistan.
President Ashraf Ghani has reposed his confidence in Pakistan on a number of occasions, but then there has been opposition to his leaning towards Pakistan. So do you think this time over it's going to be different from the previous experiences?
Well, I think as long as the Afghan government is saddled with those people who have been intrinsically against Pakistan, who have been intrinsically pro-India, and who have been intrinsically pro-war, very much wedded to the war economy, it will be very difficult for the president to move on its own. He shall have to defeat those forces who are against peace, who are against improved ties with Pakistan, and who are very much peddling the idea of certain security establishments outside of Afghanistan. So it's an uphill task that President Ghani faces. He has to navigate those troubled waters. It's a complex web. It will be very difficult for Ashraf Ghani to break through that. However, the glimmer of hope is that if he sees through the entire game, perhaps he can put his foot down, provided the reconciliation process also succeeds. There's a big if, because President Ghani's future itself is dependent on which way the reconciliation process goes.
I'm glad that you mentioned the reconciliation process, because that's the point that I wanted to come to. About the future of the reconciliation process, are you hopeful?
I'm not very hopeful, particularly in the presence of all those lobbies who still consider the Taliban as terrorists, who have been opposed to the talks with the Taliban, saying that these are basically terrorists. It's a terrorist organization. So again, this is another challenge, both for President Ghani and all those people who are opposed to the Taliban. And I would say those are basically extensions of India who don't want the Taliban to return to power, who don't want them to see as co-shareholders of power in Kabul, just because they fear that if Taliban somehow become partners in power, that it basically minimizes their sphere of influence within Kabul, as well as also in India.
Certain quarters in Afghanistan have also been voicing concerns about the human rights record of the Taliban, and as we see in this mission document also, women's rights have been mentioned. So do you think alongside those quarters viewing the Taliban as terrorists, they might also have concerns about the Taliban's human rights record?
I think the world has moved over that. Just imagine Guantanamo Bay was established by the United States of America outside the domains of outside the boundaries of America. Similarly, the moment the Americans connected with the Taliban as interlocutors, the February 29 peace deal between the US and the Taliban itself was a recognition of the fact that the United States had decided to move on. So the terrorists of yesteryears became the peace interlocutors of today, and hopefully they will remain so, just because they are not proxy terrorists. They are very much Afghans, very much rooted in the society, and this is how they have survived all these almost 20 years, 2 decades of war against the Afghan and foreign forces. And you can't really call them out as outsiders. So this is the only hope that we see for the peace process, reconciliation process, as well as for the stability and connectivity in the region.
Since you've been following the Afghan resistance for about 30 years now, what do you think is going through the minds of the Taliban? How optimistic are they about the intentions of the Afghan government with regard to the peace process?
The Taliban are not favorable as far as their view of the Afghan government is concerned. I think they are very frustrated at the moment, just because just a few days ago their spokesman basically made it clear that they had already worked out modalities for the talks, for the real talks, with the Afghan government's team. But then a day later, the presidential spokesman denied that there was any agreement, and this basically scuttled the basic understanding that the two sides had reached in Doha. It was supposed to be announced next day, and the copy of the understanding was also provided to the host government, an English translation of the Dari and Pashto text that had been prepared. But then the Afghan government, the presidential spokesman, said something different. And this, I assume, prompted the Taliban to break their commitment with the American government, and we saw 2 major suicide bombings on the weekend. And this was the first suicide bombing by the Taliban. They did not claim it, but it seems it was the work of the Taliban after the February 29 peace deal.
Lastly, let's talk about the elephant in the room, foreign troops in Afghanistan. What do you think would be agreed upon by the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban on the presence of foreign troops in the country?
I think it's still a big question mark. This is the Taliban's maximalist demand is for their altogether pullout, whereas the new American president may find some excuse, some justification retaining the 2,500 troops that will be there after January 15th. Now, to what extent does Joe Biden agree with that? To what extent is he ready to provide financial support for that? I think we shall have to wait for that.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Imtiaz.